Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Chief Strategist of Pulse Programs at Gainsight, Ruben Rabigo.
Good morning. How are y'all doing? I am thrilled to be introducing our next speaker. He is the Chief Strategy Officer of Corporate Visions. He has spent his career helping companies all over the world improve their conversations with their customers. He's authored 3 books on the topic. He's been a gracious partner of Gainsight's, done a few webinars with us, and a most recent ebook as well, which he'll talk a little bit about. Yesterday, he spoke at Pulse Academy and was the highest rated session. We're going to pump up the energy. Hold on to your seats. The next 30 minutes is going to be exciting. Please help me welcome to the stage Tim Riesterer.
Hey,
Go get him.
Hey, everybody, there's just no pressure there when he says pump them up and all that. I appreciate Ruben mentioning the 3 books that I wrote, and when I'm in an audience, I often want to ask how many people read those, but that's usually an exercise in humiliation. But I want to ask if anybody's read any books by this guy. Do you recognize his face? Who is that? Malcolm Gladwell, right. And if you read any of his books, shout one out that you've read. Blink. Outliers, another one? Tipping Point, that's the one I was looking for. Malcolm Gladwell wrote The Tipping Point. So I sort of have an author crush on him, because he sold millions of copies of his book. And The Tipping Point was his first book. It ironically became the tipping point of his career. He made millions of dollars and now charges $150,000 to give a speech like this, which is why you got me. And the reason I tell you this story is because he became rich and famous on the concept of the tipping point, but he wasn't the guy who actually founded the tipping point. In fact, this guy right here, his name is Morton Grodzins. He was a political scientist in Chicago. He did the original research and discovered the tipping point. He published first on the tipping point. He even named it the flipping tipping point. But nobody knows him. He toiled and died in academic obscurity. And he did all this 40 years before Malcolm Gladwell's book. Somehow Malcolm Gladwell sold us all a 40-year-old unoriginal idea, and we bought it. So I started to think to myself, if you really think about it, what made the difference between Gladwell and Grodzins? Grodzins had the first mover advantage. We always seek that as a company, to have the latest and greatest thing to talk about. But yet, nobody knows him. In fact, I've told this story so often, sometimes when you Google him, my picture shows up. That's how pathetic he is. And yet, Gladwell turned it into a fortune. He's now written 5 books. His most recent book is David and Goliath. He's now ripping off God. So I said, what made the difference here? And this is important to you as customer success people who are on the phones, over the web, or in person with your customers, and your lips have to move. What makes the difference isn't necessarily the technology. It isn't even your products and services. It's not always even the process you follow. It's whether or not you tell a good story. The best story is what wins. Often inferior solutions defeat superior solutions because someone told a better story. Often you recover from some sort of service nightmare or quagmire because somebody told a good story. So I have spent my time studying the art and science of great storytelling, both on the customer acquisition side and the customer success side. And I want to share with you during my time today some of the insights we've discovered about how you and your teams, with your lips moving, can be that last bastion of success and failure because you told a better story. So when all technologies are in place and all products are more or less equal and everybody has a great process, you and your teams are the differentiation. So how do you do that on purpose versus by accident? That's what I study. And recently I came across Nick's tweet there, and in his tweet he said, renewals are actually resells. And I think that's important because if you think about what we're in the business of, it is to make customers happy and satisfied, but we're also there to renew them. We're also there maybe to communicate a price increase. Sometimes we're there to sell them more as part of the relationship and the success management process. So there's an art or element of selling in all of our jobs. So I want to help us today understand a better way to have a conversation so that you can be Malcolm Gladwell and not Morton Grodzins. We did an ebook on 3 pieces of research around those 3 moments of truth in the customer success lifecycle: renewals, price increases, and upsells. I'm going to talk a little bit about those today, but we're also going to give you a link to this ebook afterwards so that you can get this as a workbook for you to use and follow up with. So what you need to know is that we spent a good share of time on the demand generation, business development, customer acquisition end of customer conversations for many years. Why? Because frankly, that's where a lot of the money was. Your companies give all the money to the business development side, don't they? The demand generation side. All the big budgets are there while customer success is trying to put a business case together. Yet you manage about 80% of their revenue. Am I right? Am I talking to the people who feel that? Yes. Well, we went there because there were a lot of budgets. Salespeople and business development. And what we discovered in the customer conversation is everyone used to go into the customer conversation to sell a customer telling the why us story. Why our products and services are superior and the benefits you're going to receive and the value proposition of our solution. It turns out customers don't think that way. When they're doing something today, when they're doing something one way today, they're not thinking about why they should pick you versus the competitor they have. They're thinking about, why should I change? Why should I do anything different? What am I missing that maybe I should be considering? So we totally reframed for customer acquisition conversations the why you story into a why change story. I'm going to talk a little bit about that today because it helps us talk about the next story. All of a sudden, we started getting interested in the last 2 years because we heard a lot from the customer success community. And they're like, that's interesting, that why change story. And I get what you're trying to do to acquire a new logo and kick out the incumbent. And it takes a lot of work to disrupt and displace the incumbent. What's our message supposed to sound like when we are the incumbent? And so we embarked on a 2-year journey to study the why stay part of the customer life cycle. And it is different. What I'm going to tell you, spoiler alert, is that the way customer success folks have conversations with existing customers is actually 180 degrees different than the way customer acquisition people have discussions with prospects. And it has to do with the psychology of the buyer. That's right, I study neuroscience, social psychology, and behavioral economics. I am not invited to any parties, but that's okay. I have so much to read. And what I'm studying are the invisible forces that shape the way humans make decisions. And then I teach other humans how to engage those invisible forces. In other words, how people will frame value and how they make choices. And if I can help you understand that, how the person on the other side of the phone is thinking about and processing your conversation, you can have a better, more impactful conversation. So that's what I want to share with you today. I do this based on existing science. So there's 40 years of behavioral science on how human beings make decisions, frame value, make choices. And what I've discovered is all those studies are typically conducted on one of 3 audiences: undergraduates, convicts, and gamblers. Because they're captive audiences that require very little money to participate in studies. What I want to do is prove that the same concepts that have been introduced to decision-making science are true in the B2B world. Because sometimes in the B2B world where I live, or the high-end B2C world, people think that you're not talking to humans anymore. You start to think you're talking to acronyms and business people who check parts of their brain at the door when they come do business. And we want to make sure that these concepts that affect human decision-making are just as true in business decisions as they are in average everyday decisions. So we build simulations with different academic partners. We work with Dr. Nick Lee at Warwick here outside of London, and Dr. Zach Tormala and Maggie Neal at Stanford University in the States. And we test and prove out frameworks for building and telling stories and messages, as well as delivering the skills to deliver those stories in a way that sets you apart from everybody else they hear, and in a way that accomplishes the goals you've set for that conversation. So in other words, I study sellers and customer success managers with their lips moving. It's a job, it's a living. Hard to explain to my kids or my mother. So what you need to understand, I got to give you like a quick tutorial on the why change science, because if you don't understand the antithesis, the customer acquisition psychology, it's going to be harder to explain the contrasting customer success psychology with existing customers. So when you're talking to a prospect, and that prospect is doing something with someone else, and you want them to make a change from what they're doing today, and do that with you the next day, you got to tell a why change story. And the foundational science to both the why change and the why stay story is something called status quo bias. Human beings live in something called status quo bias. You need to know this because every human, including yourself, lives in status quo bias. So what I'm about to tell you about how to get people to change their minds is not only useful in selling, it's just useful in raising kids or getting the date you're looking for. So these are just life lessons I'm giving you today. You're welcome. So the idea is status quo bias. There are 4 reasons people will not change their mind. There's 4 reasons that are going to keep people from doing something different. And it introduces a bias towards not making a change. We all know this as risk aversion. And here's 4 reasons, because once you understand the 4 reasons people won't change their mind, you know how to get them to change their mind. But what happens when they're already your customer and you are the status quo? We'll talk about that. So the first thing you need to know is human beings live in something called preference stability. When they make a decision, they establish a preference. You and I and your customers all prefer to keep our current preferences stable. We hate uncertainty. But what happens is, in the world of selling and change management and causing people to make a new decision, you actually got to show them that their status quo is no longer as stable, right? There's leaks and squeaks in their floorboards and no longer a safe place to be. In other words, one of the things to change people's mind is to destabilize their current preferences, because persuasion doesn't happen in certainty, persuasion happens in uncertainty. And people will resist it, and how you know they're resisting is you'll tell them something new, and then they're going to use these words. You know, that's interesting, but it sounds a lot like what I'm already doing. Or that's interesting, but it sounds a lot like what everybody else is saying. Or a lot like what everybody else is doing, or what I'm already doing. The word like here is your enemy. I have 4 daughters at home. The word like is my enemy too. But the word like is your enemy, because when they start liking you or saying you're like something, they're reestablishing the stability of their current preferences and saying that's interesting, but I don't need to do anything about it. So you actually need to destabilize their preferences so that they want to do something different, because this is no longer as safe as they thought. They're now uncertain about it. Second, people believe that the cost is all burdened on the change and that the status quo is perceived to be free. It's frictionless, right? It's free because it's just now part of the operating budget. And the goal is to help them see that there's actually a cost to staying the same. If I'm over here and perceive my current approach to be somewhat free, I don't want to find another budget and find all the time and find all the people to make a new decision. That looks hard. It's going to cost me time, money, and stomach lining. I think it's okay here. It's not perfect, but I'm not dead yet. Follow me on that one? So you got to show them that there is a risk to staying the same to overcome the risk of change. Third, people live in selection difficulty, instantly shutting down whenever there's too much information, which is always. And when there's too much information, the default position is, it's all the same. And so what has to happen is you have to show clear enough contrast. In other words, if I'm doing one thing this way today, and you're asking me to do it another way tomorrow, if it's more or less the same as what I'm already doing, I will not take a risk to get more of the same. If I'm going to take the risk of change, I got to see enough contrast, enough daylight to make the risk worthwhile. Value and the perception of value does not live in your solution. It lives in the contrast to what they're already doing. So it's important to create enough contrast for them to see the need to change. Finally, human beings are great. We can project into the future regret and blame. It's not perfect here, but I'm not dead yet. That project that you're proposing is not a solution. That is a change management project, and that could kill me. You think you're selling solutions, but really you're selling change management, and nobody really likes that. So you have to be able to tell them a hero story of how somebody like them gained the value that they're looking to achieve. So at some point, you take that emotional context for urgency, create contrast for value, and then document that for somebody so they can justify and validate that later. In other words, there's a why change messaging model. Now, this might be a useful model for customer success managers when you're trying to improve adoption. When you're trying to get people inside your customer's organization to use the thing you sold them and they're not currently using it. You might have to be a change management agent. Why should we change? Why should we use this thing? Why should we use it more than we're using it? You might have to tell a why change story. Introduce to them unconsidered needs that destabilize their current preference and show them there are needs, challenges, problems, and missed opportunities they didn't even know they had. Pivot and then show them the limitations, the gaps, and the flaws in their current approach exposed by these new needs. Create contrast with the new way of doing things so they see the value of making the change, and then tell a great hero story of someone like them who's already succeeded doing exactly that. It's impressive, it's hardworking, it's a model that we've tested time and time again. You can differentiate yourself because this story model differentiates itself against feature benefit stories, differentiates itself against problem solution stories by 50%. You can improve the perception of quality between you and other competitors by double digits if you tell this kind of story. And you can improve your persuasive power by double digits just by telling a different story. The best story wins, not always the best products and solutions. So that's all well and good in the why change world. Why do I spend that much time on that? Because I got to give you the foundation of status quo bias so that you can understand what happens when you are the status quo and what you must do. And what you must do different than customer acquisition. Why is this important? Because too many companies I see who believe that you're selling on one side acquisition and you're still selling on this side expansion and renewal, try a one-size-fits-all messaging approach and story approach. And in actuality, when they do that, they're putting you and your team and your work and your objectives at risk because it's not one size fits all. The psychology of a prospect using an incumbent that is not you and convincing them to change is different than the psychology of an existing customer who you're trying to renew, increase the price with, and upsell. I'm about to show you why and how. So you live in the world that's most often associated with the concept of why stay, or maybe why pay more, or why do more, why evolve with you. So I want to talk about those three with you briefly, but I want to land hard on why stay. Because in the customer success world, what I'm starting to see is customer success managers, the first responsibility you're taking that has anything to do with revenue is renewals. Some of you are taking responsibility for price increases. Some of you are taking responsibility for upsells and cross-sells. But in the time I've got today, I want to spend time on the renewal story framework and then offer you the ebooks. You can go look at the other frameworks and studies that we've done. So we did a bunch of studies on why change. Now we've done some studies on why stay. And what we wanted to figure out was, is a customer more likely to stay if you bring some fresh, surprising, somewhat disruptive insight, perhaps even provoke or challenge them at the moment of renewal? Or because you are the status quo bias, maybe you should actually take the exact opposite tact. And I'm not going to take credit for thinking about this. Our scientists said, Tim, there's 40 years of research that says people prefer their status quo, something called status quo bias. Maybe you should be leaning into it instead of disrupting it. It was like the heavens opened up. I'm like, yes. So we decided to test that. Would, in the renewal process, when you're at the moment of renewal, you be more effective if you introduce some sort of disruptive, provocative, challenging, why change insight story that surprised them with something they hadn't expected? Or should you do something that actually deliberately reinforces the value of you as their current status quo? So follow me on this. We took each of the four causes of status quo bias and defeated and disrupted them in why change. We built a model and then began testing it to actually reinforce the four causes. And it went something like this. In order to reinforce preference stability, since you are the preference, you open up using a scientific principle called the anchoring effect and another one called the halo effect. So an anchoring effect and a halo effect is you anchor somebody on a good thought, a positive sense of momentum and trajectory, right? It doesn't even matter how far you got, as long as you made progress. Document your current results to date and how you're moving against goal, and show them the business impact you're starting to have. And then in order to reinforce preference stability during the renewal presentation, you then take a brief moment to remind them of the previous decision process that got you here. In other words, 2 years ago when they signed the contract, you remind them of the effort they went through, the diligence they went through, all the different vendors that they interviewed, how many rounds this went, how many months this went, how many people in their organization had to make that decision. Why is this important? Because you want to reinforce their preference stability by reminding them of their preference. They did due diligence and put a lot of time and effort into their first decision, which was you. Remember that. Help them remind them by helping them remember that. Because if people have changed jobs and there are new decision makers, sometimes they come into a job and their favorite thing to do is do something new. I worked with other vendors at another company. I want to bring them in. They don't feel ownership of the decision. What you want to do is give them ownership of that decision 2 years ago. So they realize the other people in the room and others in the company put a lot of effort into this. And those who are still there from the previous decision, you want to lean into preference stability, reminding them of the decision process, because subliminally you want them to go, I don't want to do that again, right? That was hard. And we did examine everybody, and we did choose you. You don't spend a ton of time there, but it's very important to anchor the organization on the good work you've done together against the objectives you set, and then reinforce their previous preference decision that was you. Then it's time to pivot a little bit and help them realize that there's risk of change. So what you want to do is talk about the positive progress you've made, but it is a journey. And so over the course of 2 years, we've gotten this far and done these things. These are the other things companies like you who have had success still do. At some point, it's really important to not disrupt this because you're going to lose that momentum. So there's a nuanced way to share it, but what you're trying to do is help them see the future and the things you're going to help them do and the continued progress, but by that inferring that any disruption at this point could take them steps backwards and erase the progress they've already made. And then at some point, you don't necessarily actually highlight the cost of your competitor and talk about how much it's going to cost to change. You remind them of the investments they already made, the one-time investments. Remember when you brought us on board, this is good news. You put this much money into some APIs and some integration. You put this many people through training. You rearranged your processes. And now this thing is just operating like part of your daily procedure. And the idea is it's frictionless. It's just operating. What are you implying? If they're going to make a change, you might have to do that all over again. The science here is called sunk cost. Some people call it sunk cost fallacy. You as humans, we as humans, and your customers humans all live in status quo bias, and we all live in sunk cost fallacy. If you've ever read half a book or watched part of a movie and said, this sucks, and then you kept watching and reading because you're like, well, I put this much time into it, you have lived sunk cost fallacy. So part of this is you have to stir some of these sort of invisible forces in your customer and say, we've invested in this together, invested in that, invested in that. Those are one-time costs. They're already sunk. Now you're just operating sort of frictionless. It's just part of your standard operating procedure. By that, you're invoking the fact that, oh my goodness, if we wanted to change, look how hard the process is, look at all these things we'd have to do. And the truth is, people want to stick with the same. You just want to give them a little extra nudge to want to stick with you. Is that making sense so far? So what I see happening, though, unfortunately, is everybody takes the renewal moment as an opportunity to load it up with all of your new stuff. Like, here it is. Ta-da! Look at all this stuff we've been doing. You know, it's like, this is all the goodness. And you didn't expect this, but we brought you this. And hardcore try to use the new stuff as the reason for them to resubscribe. And the reality is, as you're about to see in the study, that sort of disruption at the moment of renewal puts the whole deal into question. Gee, if I got to change that much and do that much new stuff, I might as well examine all my options. So instead, the idea is introduce any advances you've made as sort of continued evolutionary advances that make sure your customer feels you've protected them from FOMO, the fear of missing out. You want to show them that you've left no daylight between you and the competition, that there's no real reason to make the change. Because think about this psychologically. When you want to beat the incumbent, you got to create a ton of contrast and differentiation. But when you are the incumbent, you want to show that there's no contrast and no differentiation. Why? Because people won't switch and take the risk for more of the same. So the counterintuitive thing you have to talk about is kind of how much everybody's the same. I know it sounds weird, but the reality is your competitive advances are just part of improving the trajectory of their business. An ongoing investment that both of you are making in improving the trajectory of their business, it's not supposed to be super disruptive and differentiated because it creates a moment where people think they have to make a big change. And then if they have to make a big change, why do they just simply do it with you? Maybe they should look at your competitors. So what happened is we put these two approaches to the test. We put 400 people into a simulation of renewal in the human capital management market, piece of software and experience. Think of it as like software and some process, a little bit like what Accenture might do. And 2 years into the contract, it's ready for renewal. In one case, we told the story of how cool, we found some new research, and there's some new needs and some new ways to fix your enrollment process and improve employee satisfaction and reduce your turnover. It's going to be great, and here's some new things that we want to give you in order to solve for that. In the other case, we walked them through the model I just said, and at the end, talked about some advances we're making to continue their journey and progress that they're making. One was super disruptive, but still all about winning and helping them win even more than they've been winning. The other one was a little bit more methodical, reinforcing, and here's what we're going to continue to do for you. One could argue less inspiring than the other one, but what did we see in the results? So everybody was split into the two groups, and they didn't hear both pitches. One group heard one pitch, the other heard the other pitch. And so all of the results you're about to see are super conservative because they didn't even get to compare them. They just got to react to what they heard. And what did we see? It turned out the science was right. The why stay framework won. In fact, the people that heard the why stay message rated their relationship and the message they heard and the rapport they had as 10% more favorable than those that got that new, fresh, disruptive insight. It turned out by bringing that sort of disruptive insight, you got penalized. They didn't think of you as favorably as they did when you reinforced their status quo bias. Turns out when we asked all kinds of questions about renewal, likelihood of renewal, willingness to pay more renewal, blah, 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 it turned out they were 13% more likely to renew and rate that with an intensity level when you told the why stay story as opposed to the why change story. Said another way, if you disrupt and try to challenge them, just like in customer acquisition mode, you actually are 13% less likely to get that renewal. And 11% less likely to switch. So we asked the question in two different ways to make sure our stats were accurate. The people who heard the why stay story were 11% less likely to switch, less likely to consider a low-cost or discounted competitor. Those that heard the disruptive message were 11% more likely to switch and engage discounted competitors. It turns out that using the approach that everybody seems to think is so important and impressive and powerful in sales is 180 degrees opposite of what you need to do in customer success. So what I want to give you today is a strategic tool for you and your teams. We shouldn't be taking secondhand leftovers from the sales side or demand gen side and trying to bend them and contort them into our world. We should have research-backed, dedicated models for telling our story and renewing more of our business and doing it on purpose versus by accident. So, the why stay story for customer retention. What you're going to find in the ebook I'm about to give you a link to is the second study we did on the concept of why pay. In the area of why pay, it turns out if you want to ask people for more money, don't disrupt them and tell them about this new thing and ask them for more money. Ask them for more money by reinforcing the status quo. They will actually be willing to pay you more with the why stay framework than they are with the why change framework. We were shocked again. We thought, well, maybe when you're asking them for more money, you got to tell them this new thing, this exciting thing, this disruptive thing. And it turns out that the numbers got even worse. the likelihood of renewal, favorability, the likelihood of switching. The gap even widened between why stay and why change. It is a powerful tool to increase renewals and communicate price increases. And we have a framework that appends the why stay framework for you. And then finally, why evolve? Many of us get in the business of upsells, cross-sells. In other words, you've been doing this with us, you've been doing really well, we've documented these results, but some things have changed in the meantime, and there's some emerging trends that are creating challenges we couldn't have expected 2 years ago. That's why we've modified the product to get you to this next level, and we'd like you to move from our on-prem to our cloud product, et cetera, et cetera. There's a why evolve framework for the upsell that I want to give you as well, and it turns out it's primarily rooted in the why stay story formula with a little sort of jump into why change to create some emotional disruption, but always in the context of our partnership. So why stay renewals, why pay price increases, and why evolve upsells have a distinct customer success management, customer expansion psychology involved in them, where your existing customers prefer you and would prefer to keep that preference stable. Make sure you lean into that. Don't disrupt it. When you are not the status quo, disrupt. When you are the status quo, defend. And I'm not saying defend them not changing or doing anything with you. Defend your position as status quo. The science is on your side, and now the frameworks are in place for you to do this deliberately. So the good news is, I've given you something to help your company continue to win and expand the majority of the business. I would like to see that budget proportionally spent on the people who own the majority of the business, right? That's you. But you have to come with a strategy that says, we can own a number and we can make this happen. And hopefully I gave you those today. Here's the ebook. There's the link. So you might want to get a picture of that. It's an ebook with the 3 studies. It's got templates in there to show you how to build why stay, why pay, why evolve stories. The studies are described, examples are given, and the templates are yours. Our research is for you. We've got a booth over there. During the lunch hour, stop by, fill in a card. I'd be willing to do this as a webcast to your teams if you found this important and essential for your teams to step it up. So, and I'm grateful for our partnership with Gainsight in delivering this, because they understand too, technology is important, but you as humans with your lips moving are just as important. So my challenge to you, based on what I just taught you in 30 minutes, is who are you going to be? Gladwell or Grodzins? Thank you very much.